Seminar that we're hosting today on experiencing divine forgiveness, empirical insights, and practical implications. This seminar has already been made possible by a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation that has been supporting a project called Psychological Perspectives on Divine Forgiveness, which has been led by Professor Frank Fincham, who's here with us today. That project provided 10 subaward grants to scholars studying different aspects of divine forgiveness. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the John Templeton Foundation and to also thank Professor Fincham for his role in expanding quite exponentially the psychological research on divine forgiveness through these different subawards. Much of the work you'll see today would not have been possible without his vision and commitment to the study of divine forgiveness. I'd also like to thank all the grantees who are able to join us today to share their work, as well as everyone who has been involved in the research that will be shared today in some way, whether it's collaborators, research assistants, participants, and others. And then, of course, a special thanks to Dr. Kate Jackson-Meyer for all her work coordinating this event. And for those who are joining us as part of the audience, we welcome you as well to this seminar, and thank you for joining. So about a year ago, shortly after the 10 subawards were granted, the recipients gathered to share their initial research plans and exchange ideas, which, that was about October last year. And so building on this initial gathering, this seminar is intended to provide those grantees an opportunity to share a bit more about what they've learned so far a year into the project, both with each other, but as well as with others who may be interested in learning about the research that is taking place on divine forgiveness through this project, and how it might be useful to their own work. So today you'll hear talks from Professor Fincham and several of the grantees participating in the Psychological Perspectives on Divine Forgiveness project. Because of time constraints, each talk will be somewhat brief, but our hope here is that the talks will just be the starting point of conversations that will continue beyond the seminar. We've reserved some time for Q&A directly after Professor Fincham's talk. So please type in and submit any questions you have during his talk, and we'll pose those to him immediately after he finishes his talk. And then after that, we will invite each grantee to present one after each other. We've tried our best to reserve about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, addressing all the grantee presentations. And so we'll save any questions on those talks until the very end. But as each grantee presents, feel free to type in and submit any questions you have, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible once all grantees have presented. So with that, I'll hand things over to Kate, who will take things from here.
All right, thank you so much, Richard. I know we're all looking forward to hearing about the research and being able to have this conversation together. So it's quite an honor for me to introduce Professor Frank Fincham. He is the director of the Florida State University Family Institute and an expert on forgiveness in all its forms. His grant from the John Templeton Foundation to study the psychology of divine forgiveness was specifically designed to establish research on the perception and experience of divine forgiveness to help understand its psychological implications and interplay with other forms of forgiveness. Our panelists represent some of the sub-grantees of this large grant. And we'll give you some time to present Frank, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll go on to the grantees. So thank you.
Well, I first of all would like to thank you all for organizing this. This is wonderful, and I appreciate it a great deal. So let me begin by just giving you some context for the research that we'll be talking about today. Can everybody see the screen, the
Yes.
PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture now. And I want to give you the context for forgiveness research as it emerged historically. It's been part of our human existence for centuries, but interestingly, there were only 5 scientific studies on the topic of forgiveness itself before 1985. Why would that be? Well, one reason was because it was considered to be a religious topic, and it was a topic that scientists didn't want to touch for fear of being seen as somehow religious partisans. But there's been an explosion of research on forgiveness since then. Recently, I did a search of a database, and now there are over 4,000 articles in peer-reviewed journals in the last 10 years, which is an amazing growth. This growth occurred in part because the John Templeton Foundation decided it was going to seed money for research on forgiveness in general. But before we get into it, forgiveness is a very misunderstood construct or idea. So I want to just unpack what forgiveness is and is not. And this characterized a lot of the activity of early research on forgiveness. It was just nailing down, what does it mean when we forgive someone? Well, forgiveness is not forgetting that there was a transgression. Forgiveness only arises between people when one person wrongs another. And you often hear the phrase forgive and forget. No, do not forget. As John F. Kennedy said, do not forgive your enemies, but do not forget their names. So forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness doesn't mean that there should be no consequences for the wrong that was perpetrated. It doesn't mean that you stop feeling pain or grieving for the wrong that was perpetrated against you. And it doesn't mean that you condone what happened to you. It doesn't mean that you pretend that this unacceptable behavior is now acceptable. That is not forgiveness. And very importantly, you don't have to trust the person who hurt you. And even more importantly, you don't have to reestablish a relationship with the person who hurt you. And this is a very, very serious thing, because forgiveness is not being stupid and getting back with someone who is dangerous for you. So you don't reconcile with the person necessarily. That person has to earn your trust again. And then if it is safe and prudent to do so, you reconcile with them. So forgiveness is really giving up a perceived right to get even. It's giving up the attitude, you owe me. It's something like a canceled debt, although that's not a great analogy, because once a debt is canceled, it no longer exists. But forgiveness doesn't mean that the hurt no longer exists or the transgression no longer exists. You will take time to work through the hurt, and the transgression will forever exist. Going back to JFK, forgive your enemies, but remember their names. So a lot of the early research, as I said, was dealing with a clear understanding of what it means to forgive someone. Now, there are many reasons for the growth of research on forgiveness in the 21st century, but one that stands out is the belief, and it is now very well documented, that forgiveness is propitious to mental health. Let's, as we broach this topic, distinguish different types of forgiveness. We've been talking about interpersonal forgiveness so far, and as intimated, this is a well-established field. In fact, the second handbook on forgiveness has already been published a few years ago. But there's a second type of forgiveness, self-forgiveness, where you forgive yourself for something that you have done. This was labeled as a stepchild of forgiveness research in 2005 by myself, but that label no longer is pertinent because this field of research has emerged, and there's a handbook on self-forgiveness that appeared in 2017. Now, these are earthly forms of forgiveness. There's a third type of forgiveness, divine forgiveness, which I would argue is the new, quote, stepchild of forgiveness research. Now, why would I say this? Well, I say it because if we look at publications, and here's a graph of them from 2014 to 2018, you will see the gray bars show the number of studies published per year for interpersonal forgiveness. The orange bars show the number of studies published for self-forgiveness. And the tiny little blue bars show the number of studies published on divine forgiveness. But this is not the only reason for saying that divine forgiveness really is the, quote, stepchild of forgiveness research. It's also the fact that the research on divine forgiveness has been scattered and non-systematic. This is because it is not usually the focus of the research. Usually what people did was just throw in a question about divine forgiveness as an additional measure to add to something else that they were already studying. And the reason they did this most likely was because there was a single item that had gained favor for use in research. That item was usually, I know that God forgives me. Now, the problem with a single item measure from a research perspective is that it's inherently unreliable. And in fact, there is a famous paper published in 1978 by Jacobi called The Folly of Single Indicators, showing that we shouldn't really use just one question to measure something. Well, why might divine forgiveness matter? There are two lines of argument that are possible. There's a rational argument, and that is that the vast majority of the world's population profess a religious faith, and that religious faith is core to the believer and motivates their behavior. Notice that even with the decline in formal religious affiliation in the United States, 91% of people in the United States still believe in a supreme being. Now, despite this pervasive belief in a supreme being and in the profession of a religious faith worldwide, most of the empirical treatments of forgiveness, and these are the words of two famous researchers in the field, have tended to overlook the deep religious roots of the concept of forgiveness. This oversight is unfortunate because basic research on forgiveness could probably be enriched considerably by examining the ways that religious traditions, beliefs, and rituals influence the common earthly aspects of forgiveness. Those words of Worthington and McCullough were written in 1999, and not much has changed since this observation was made. Not until now, with this new focus that I've tried to place on divine forgiveness. Let's consider this empirical argument for why divine forgiveness matters. Across 22 studies involving over 4,500 participants, we know that interpersonal forgiveness is related to depressive symptoms. It's about minus 0.26, which is not a huge relationship, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And we know that across 36 studies, the association with self-forgiveness is somewhat larger. It is minus 0.48. But does divine forgiveness add to our understanding? Maybe divine forgiveness just doesn't matter because we already, what is technically called, account for variance in forgiveness, in depression with interpersonal forgiveness and self-forgiveness. Well, I did 2 studies and I showed that in both studies, self-forgiveness, interpersonal forgiveness, and divine forgiveness all independently help us understand depressive symptoms. So the answer is yes. Divine forgiveness does add to our understanding, but it gets better than that. Consider again that over 60 studies have investigated well-being correlates of trait self-forgiveness. Most, 36 of them, have focused on depressive symptoms, yielding an effect size, as I mentioned earlier, of minus 0.48. This is with over 10,000 people. That impressive? You bet that's impressive. In social science research, these kinds of associations are pretty substantial. But what happens when we consider divine forgiveness? Is it really that simple? Well, this shows what happens when you consider divine forgiveness. On the x-axis is self-forgiveness, increasing levels of self-forgiveness, and on the y-axis, we have increasing levels of depressive symptoms. And I want you to look at the green line. The green line shows people who have high levels of experience of divine forgiveness. And the blue line shows people who have low levels of divine forgiveness. And what we can see from this graph is that when self-forgiveness is low, divine forgiveness really lowers depressive symptoms for those with high levels of experience of divine forgiveness. It's almost as if divine forgiveness is a substitute for self-forgiveness. As you get higher levels of self-forgiveness, divine forgiveness doesn't matter as much. It doesn't make a difference to depressive symptoms. But at low levels, if you can't forgive yourself, but you believe God forgives you, that is protective against feeling depressed. So self-forgiveness is a good thing for depression. How might self-forgiveness be increased? Well, if you look at the longitudinal relationships between self-forgiveness and divine forgiveness, that might give you some idea of what causes what. And this figure here shows divine forgiveness and self-forgiveness at 2 different time points. And what we see from this figure is that initial divine forgiveness predicts later self-forgiveness, but initial self-forgiveness doesn't predict later divine forgiveness. So if divine forgiveness increases, self-forgiveness increases over time. What about interpersonal forgiveness? Well, it's the same story there. Divine forgiveness at time 1 increases interpersonal forgiveness at time 2, but not vice versa. And this is controlling for religiosity. What are the interplay of different types of forgiveness? Because they are related to each other. And we can see that interpersonal and self-forgiveness have the highest relationship, nearly 0.30, but both of them are also related to divine forgiveness. And this could be the source of the relationship between interpersonal and self-forgiveness because they're both related to divine forgiveness. This is what is called the third variable problem in research. So I looked at that and no, divine forgiveness does not account for the relationship between self-forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness. But divine forgiveness does impact the relationship between self-forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness. We see that dotted line with the crosses. Those are the people who have high levels of experienced divine forgiveness. And we see that the relationship between self-forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness is strongest for people who experience high levels of divine forgiveness. So divine forgiveness is important for understanding the relationship between self-forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness. So I'm making the case, and I hope I've done it successfully, that that divine forgiveness really matters, and we shouldn't ignore it any longer. So to conclude, I want to just state that instead of the scattered research, we should now really start doing systematic research. But in doing that, we can't just do the kind of work that I've been sharing with you. We need to start from the beginning. We need to describe the phenomenon. What does it really mean to experience divine forgiveness? This is foundational to our understanding, and I'm very pleased to say that some of the projects that have been funded are looking at what is called qualitative research, where the focus isn't on numbers, but on understanding people's experience. We need to pay attention to the unique character of divine forgiveness, because human forgiveness and divine forgiveness are not equivalent. We need to look at things like God concepts, which we know are likely to influence divine forgiveness. Indeed, I've already shown that how you view God does relate to your experience of divine forgiveness. The nature of our relationship to God matters in our experience of divine forgiveness. And there has been a tendency to focus on older samples in the early research, and we need to broaden the sample studied. And so with support from the Templeton Foundation, we are funding 10 research teams from Italy, Spain, Australia, South Africa, and 6 teams from the USA. And this symposium comprises a sampling of the work being conducted. And with that, I will turn it back over to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Professor Fincham. That was fantastic, and we are so grateful for your work. Attendees are welcome to ask any questions using that Q&A feature that should be at the bottom of your screen there. The panelists can see the questions, so we can see, and we have some questions that have been coming in. We only have a few minutes for questions, Professor Fincham. I will ask one of the questions that have been asked here in the chat. So one of our attendees is asking, can you say more about why human forgiveness and divine forgiveness are not equivalent? If we take human forgiveness to be replacing ill will for a wrongdoer with goodwill, for instance, why can't we take this to be the same thing referred to by divine forgiveness?
That's an excellent question. Well, for one thing, we can't hurt the divine, the supreme being. And so in that sense, we are not in a position where things are the same for interpersonal forgiveness and divine forgiveness. Also, our views of divine forgiveness are affected by eschatological beliefs, our beliefs about the hereafter, about infinity, and so on, which don't influence interpersonal forgiveness. And let me give you an example. When God forgives this perfect being, do we really have to worry about trust and earning back the right to have a relationship. No, because God is not hurt by our sins in the sense that we have the power to somehow influence God's well-being. And so often well, not often, but always, when forgiveness occurs by the Supreme Being, reconciliation is instantaneous. Reconciliation occurs and is part of the very act of forgiveness. That is not the case in interpersonal forgiveness. So there are elements of differences, but that initial observation made by the questioner, I think, is of course true. It is, look, did God stop having goodwill towards us when we sinned? No, I don't think so, not by my understanding of most religious perspectives. So in that sense, again, there is a difference. So I don't think goodwill gets restored because there always was goodwill. But we're getting into all kinds of eschatological and religious beliefs, and they will, by definition, have some impact on the boundary conditions under which you can talk about divine forgiveness. And I don't want to get drawn into different beliefs and have a religious discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes, and I know there's so many great questions here, and that was really helpful. So thank you. There are quite a few questions just wondering about other religions and just religious diversity in terms of divine forgiveness, to the extent it's been studied, how the definitions might differ, anything. There are just quite a few questions about that. So I don't know if you could just maybe point us in a direction in terms of thinking interreligiously about this concept.
Well, clearly, divine forgiveness is very obvious in the Abrahamic faith, and I'm very proud of the fact that we have some grantees who are studying divine forgiveness in the Jewish community and in not just in Christianity. Now, obviously, in some faiths, such as Hinduism, I don't think divine forgiveness is that pertinent. But even so, you know, a huge proportion of the world's population does fall under the general rubric of the Abrahamic faith. I can't speak to other religions. I just don't have the expertise.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're at time for this. I know that there's so many more questions that people have, so I think we're looking forward to the discussion and looking forward to the different kinds of research that have come out of this. So thank you, Professor Fincham. Our next presenter, we're going to be going into now the sub-grantees of this award. And so our next presenter is Professor Jonathan Bartholomeus. He's a lecturer and researcher at the University of Adelaide with a research interest in and passion for the moral psychology topics of justice, power, and forgiveness. Presently, his research efforts are devoted towards developing a measure of the experience of divine forgiveness and understanding how people's perception of their just treatment drives their attitudes and behaviors in personal, relational, and political spheres.
Very good. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Very good. All right. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, as Kate introduced me, I'm Jonathan Bartholomeus. I'm working with Professor Peter Strelin on this work, and we're focusing on developing a measure of divine forgiveness, a psychometric or a self-report measure. We're conducting our work here in Australia, we're down here at the University of Adelaide, which is on the very southern edge or southern tip of Australia, in the beautiful city of Adelaide, and that's where I'm zooming in from today. So it's very nice to be here. So our project really has two main aims. We're sort of halfway through it at the moment. We're aiming to understand how best to quantify the experience of divine forgiveness, and then the second measure, as I stated, we're aiming to produce a robust and generalizable psychometric measure of the construct. So we're doing this across 4 studies with a number of sub-studies. Our first studies center around a prototype analysis, and then our second study looks at item generation and developing the initial measure. At the moment in our work, we're sort of up to about here. So I'll be sharing about sort of our initial findings so far. And that's, I think, all I'll have time for. Okay, so a prototype analysis, what is it? Really the aim is to seek consensus from a non-specialist audience on the central and peripheral components of divine forgiveness. So prototype theory suggests that prototypical structure has 2 aspects. The first is that people must be able to make accurate judgments about the structure or the concept. And the second is that the quality of the representations, either good or poor, must affect a person's cognitions about the concept. So using these principles, we're setting out to sort of develop or to study divine forgiveness from a prototypical standpoint. So in our first study, or our first sub-study, study 1A, we aim to compile a list of the features of divine forgiveness. So we're using, we sampled from 300 participants, and we took equal sampling from the world's major monotheistic religions, so Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So answering some of the questions that came through before. And this is a theme that you'll see running throughout all of this work, or our work. So we asked participants to essentially list the features that came to mind when we asked them to describe divine forgiveness. One researcher went through and initially coded over 2,000 individual units of meaning, and then 2 researchers came together and grouped those units into attribute categories. We ended up with about 143 replicated units of meaning. The top 10 came out as this. So unsurprisingly, comes from God or a higher power. And we have aspects or ideas of repentance, mercy, love, and peace. Interesting, releases us from guilt and shame. So these are some of the other things that have come through from looking, from just asking people how they might describe divine forgiveness. In the next study, we wanted to consider what are the central components, or what are central to the experience of divine forgiveness. So we asked 173 participants, again representing the 3 major monotheistic religions, to rate the extent to which each attribute category aligned with their idea of divine forgiveness. So in this way, we could develop ratings or strength ratings for each of the items or each of our attributes. Here's what we found. We sort of, you can see up the top there, we have things like honesty and compassion were rated as the most central to divine forgiveness, along with acknowledging wrongdoing or shortcoming, peace, hope, kindness, similar to what people mentioned in the first study. Very good. So in studies 1C and 1D, we wanted to move on to verify the central and peripheral features of divine forgiveness. So to do this, we developed 2 descriptions of the experience. So the first description had central attributes, and the second description had peripheral attributes. And we asked participants to rate how accurately each description sort of aligned with their idea of divine forgiveness. We did this first with 143 participants, and then with 331 participants. And again, they represented the major monotheistic religions. So study 1C, we used 2 descriptions of divine forgiveness. So these were central and peripheral. And then in study 3, in study 1D, sorry, we wanted to make it a little bit more rigorous. So we used a central and a mixed and a peripheral. To give you an idea of the descriptions, here's sort of what we came up with. You can see there in the green is the central components of divine forgiveness, and in the red are the peripheral. So participants read something like this. They read, Sam had sinned. She acknowledged her wrongdoings and shortcomings with honesty and sought forgiveness from God / a high power. She demonstrated genuine repentance and in turn received compassion and mercy. And that sort of was a scenario constructed around the central attributes of divine forgiveness. What we saw is in study 1C that participants could indeed see a difference or rate a difference between the scenarios in the expected direction. And then in study 1D, we saw that the 3 scenarios leveled out as we expected. So they rated the central scenario as the most representative of divine forgiveness on average, and the peripheral as the least. So across these four sort of sub-studies, this one major study, we feel like we've established the central and peripheral components of divine forgiveness as generated by our participants. And we've sort of verified that people can actually distinguish between central and peripheral components. So moving on to study 2, the aim here is to develop a valid and reliable measure of divine forgiveness. We're calling this the Divine Forgiveness Questionnaire. So we started off in developing this measure by generating a list of 206 candidate items. To do this, to generate this list, we took a number of items from a number of different spots. So we took the 100 central features from study 1 from our prototype analysis. We did a literature review of the extant divine forgiveness research and also interpersonal and self-forgiveness measures, and we sort of manipulated or changed those items to relate to divine forgiveness. We also conducted a review of all the major monotheistic texts, so the Quran, the Tanakh, the Quran, and the Bible, and we searched for in 2 different translations for the following the terms on the screen there. So forgiveness, forgiven, reconcile, repentance, all of these ideas. And we took each mention and we tried to turn those into items as well. From those 206 items, we sent 150 items out to 7 experts. And these, again, were from the 3 major monotheistic religions. We have professors of Islamic studies, rabbis, we have rabbinical teachers who reside in Israel. And then we have professors of New Testament theology and priests and lectures in theology. So a good representation, we felt. And we use this to calculate a CVR or a rating of each item, which helped us to bring about or to refine our items. We ended up with 92 items, which we presented randomly to 1,000 participants. And then we also asked them to complete these auxiliary measures on screen, which I'll run through a little bit more in a bit more detail now. So we expected that our measure should relate positively to religiosity, spirituality, perception of God's grace and mercy, gratitude and self-forgiveness. It should relate negatively to existential anxiety, guilt, shame, fear of death and depression. And it should have a null or no association with sort of a sense of humor and social desirable responding. Our initial results, using exploratory factor analysis, a statistical technique, we refined our 92 items down to 18 items, and we saw that sort of 3 sub-factors or 3 sub-components of divine forgiveness have come out of the data, which are really interesting. So we can see that the first factor or the first sub-component is this idea of moral fortification. So God's forgiveness helps me to be a better person, builds my faith, or holds me accountable. Our second factor or sub-facet is sort of the outcomes that one feels of being forgiven. So when God forgives me, I'm able to let go, or I am accepted, or I can forgive myself. I am at peace. And the third factor is this idea of a removal of sin, shame, and guilt. So my sin is removed or abolished, or this idea of guilt and shame being erased or removed. In terms of our associations that we saw positive correlations mostly where we expected. Notably, there's a very high correlation there with God's grace, which we're still thinking about and we're planning to explore further. But generally, we saw positive associations where we expected them. We did not see the negative associations we expected. In fact, we saw a few positive correlations, but these were quite small. So we're still, these are the initial results. We've only had them for a few weeks, so we're still thinking our way through them. And then we didn't see the null associations quite as we expected. So again, small results, small positive correlations there. So our preliminary conclusions for this point in our project is that we have developed a measure of the divine forgiveness. The measure seems very tightly organized, so highly correlated factors with high internal consistency. They had some expected associations, but a number of unexpected associations. And we're planning to, dig into this a little further to see what's really going on there. Our application, we feel like this, our aim is that this tool is is a valuable tool for future research, a systematic way that we can measure this construct for future researchers, but also it might be a resource for counsellors and psychotherapists in facilitating a strength-based approach to therapy with spiritual integration. Thank you everyone for listening. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back over.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating work, and we appreciate it. Our next speaker will be Professor Kay Cook. Professor Cook serves as Professor of Psychology at Gordon College and Dean of the College of Psychology and Human Services. As a developmental psychologist, she carries her interest in growth and change into research on various forms of forgiveness and well-being. She is PI with Richard Cowden of the subgrant Experiences of Divine Forgiveness Among Christians, a multi-method, multi-country project. You're on mute.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this research. As Kate said, Richard and I are working together on this research, and we have focused on doing theoretical work at the beginning as well as interviews, hoping from our conversations with people in multiple countries to think more carefully about, from different perspectives, about what divine forgiveness means. We have also in our work worked with interdisciplinarity. We have worked most closely with several theologians, including with Kate, and appreciate your contributions, Kate. Our focus has been on experiences of divine forgiveness. We work with Christians and only with Christians because they currently are the largest religious group in the world. And in our work, we have a large group of collaborators, and I will mention some of their names soon. Our working definition for reconciliation with God makes it clear that after committing a wrongdoing, the person experiences a sense of disharmony in their relationship with God, introducing stress or tension. Reconciliation with God takes place after disharmony, and our focus is on state rather than trait, divine forgiveness. From the perspective of stress and coping theory, a Christian might attempt to cope with a personal theme, with a personal sin, by an approach or avoidance orientation. Engaging in repentance with God is one example of an approach orientation that takes place in the context of the person's relationship with God. When we transgress, we experience disharmony and maybe distance from God, and the tension experienced from this leads us to seek harmony. We do so by engaging in these two processes, which are together associated with reconciliation with God. We see divine forgiveness as part of a broader process of this reconciliation. We began our project supervising interviews with 10 country collaborators in 10 countries, including me in the US. I give a shout out to these collaborators now, some of whom are on this webinar. We could not have done this without you. Wojciech Kaftansky, Patricia Battaglia, Donna Lamb, Andrea Bachara, Annabella Osei-Tutu, Shanmuk Campbell, Taganing Kurniadi, Patrick Namaruzzi, Zuhal Agilkea Sahin. Our goal was 120 interviews. Our collaborators completed a total of 108. These interviews are challenging to do because, of course, people don't want to talk about their sins. All interviews followed the same format. Some questions were open-ended. What does it mean to be forgiven by God? And some were constrained. Rate the severity of the violation, transgression on a 5-point scale. All interviews were transcribed by our collaborators and translated as needed. We place our work within the relational spirituality perspective. Divine forgiveness takes place within a network of relationships with self, sin, and God. Each corner represents a relational node. the nature of God, self, and sin, all in relation to the self. We use meta-theme analysis to make sense of the interviews, and you can see the citation at the bottom of the screen. Meta-theme analysis is a qualitative method for cross-cultural analysis that emerged from thematic analysis. Higher order themes can emerge from the more fine-grained analyses characteristic of thematic analysis through an iterative process of identifying and testing shared meanings across interviews, not by counting frequencies of themes, but by applying systematic, collaborative techniques to team-based, multi-site research. This process results in identifying overarching meta-themes across a set of qualitative data, which we have derived for the research. So here's an example. We present this data for illustrative purposes only, since it's based on one question, and I'm well aware, I appreciate your comments, Frank, on the problems with one question. And the question is, what does divine forgiveness mean to you? According to Namaruzi, in traditional African religions, one must maintain positive relationships with ancestors because ancestors act as intercessors between self and God. In our South African interviews, there appeared to be confidence in one's relationship with God, but a strong emphasis on what one should do to maintain this relationship. So there was a lot of conversation about accountability, prayer, fasting, and other activities to keep one, to make sure that one has shown repentance. In our Brazilian interviews, according to Dr. Battaglia, traditional African religions also impact experiences of divine forgiveness. Participants from Brazil focused on the relationship, but as the goal for resolving one's act of wrongdoing. Brazilians worried about the effect of their sin. They worried about making themselves unworthy or distant from God, suggesting a view of God as more authoritarian, perhaps, or themselves as being more aware of their distance from God as being created by this wrongdoing. The dual processes of repentance and absolution were part of reconciliation in each country, but the context alters the expression of faith, at least in response to this one question. To frame this in the relational spirituality triad, the meta-theme analysis of African religions illustrates the person's relationship with God, the left side of the triangle. The practice of African religions in one's culture, or family of origin, or even in oneself, shifts one's relationship with God toward acts of repentance if one is South African, or towards a more authoritarian relationship, or perhaps greater sensitivity to the distance if one is Brazilian. A hypothesis at this point. At the same time as we were collecting interviews, we produced a chapter, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven." The citation is here. The chapter takes a relationally embedded dual process model approach for understanding experiences of reconciliation with God following acknowledgement of personal sin. In this chapter, we identified the two core processes of reconciliation, repentance and absolution, based on a lit review and somewhat on the interviews which were going on at the same time. We conceptualize these processes as taking place within the relational triad. Our next step is to better characterize these processes and relationships by identifying barriers and facilitators of divine forgiveness. Also in this chapter, after cognitive interviewing, item analysis interviewing, and pre-testing, we propose a possible scale model measure of reconciliation with God. State reconciliation with God. The scale has 8 items, 4 of which address repentance and 4 absolution. We're in the process of validating the scale by collecting surveys from 200 individuals in each of 6 countries. Study 2. This may have a longitudinal component. In this study, we're also measuring well-being, including self-forgiveness. The process has proceeded relatively quickly in Indonesia and South Africa, but is challenging in Brazil, India, and Turkey, and I give our collaborators credit. This is not easy to do. Our collaborators have struggled to identify participants willing to take the online survey and to finish it. I'll close with some thoughts on the implications of our work. Several people said in response to the interviews that they experienced a greater communion with God. It seems clear there needs to be more conversation in churches about the process of reconciliation with God. Jonathan Rutledge, one of our collaborators and a theologian, deconstructs theological confusions in our interviews. For example, people say that God doesn't punish, but God disciplines, and those are similar. And discipline is a form of punishment. The scale can be used by practitioners to help clients attend to the disharmony they experience. The disharmony may not be related to a particular wrongdoing, but may, in their mind, but may be a result of it. If one, for example, one may experience free-floating anxiety that they don't realize is triggered by wrongdoing, or unresolved grief as a result of a sin. Items on the scale may suggest components of the experience that are too central in one's memory of sin or too absent, that could be addressed perhaps by mindfulness or the spiritual disciplines. Christians transgress every day. The experience of seeking divine forgiveness leads to an experience of greater communion with God for many, perhaps especially for those from collectivistic cultures. But at this point, that is a hypothesis. If we were able to increase participant proclivity to seek reconciliation with God, this could lead to greater communion with God and the benefits to health and well-being that a robust relationship with God or other relational being provides.
Thank you. And as a reminder, you can put in any questions in the question and answer, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer the questions live. And sometimes the panelists are also answering them through the feature. So I know there's a lot to think about and talk about, so please utilize that. Our next speaker is Professor Joe Currier. He's a licensed psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of South Alabama. His research broadly focuses on understanding and addressing the multifaceted role of spirituality and religion in trauma, moral injury, and other mental health challenges in education, training, and clinical practice.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. So I'm coming to you amid a rainy, humid day in Mobile, Alabama. So I hope that others are maybe enjoying better weather than we are this morning. I think as the title highlights, this mini presentation will summarize findings from an ecological momentary assessment study that our team conducted as part of our subaward project. I want to thank Dr. Jackson Meyer and Richard for organizing this great event. I also want to thank Frank and his team, for supporting our project, and of course the John Templeton Foundation for making all of this work possible. I think on behalf of our whole team, just really honored to be part of this initiative. The list of names here, show the folks, who are playing key roles in our subaward project. Ward Davis is my co-leader, on this grant. Ryan McDermott is serving as our lead statistician. Rob Dvorak is our kind of expert EMA consultant, and others are graduate research assistants, who did, a lot of the work that made this project possible today. Here's a QR code for our registration page with the Open Science Framework. If you're interested in learning more about our study, you can simply click on the link. You'll find a fuller description about our overall project, along with copies of the measures, that we used, analytic code, for our analyses. We're also uploading de-identified versions of our data sets, to our OSF site. So if anybody would be interested in doing any additional analyses or secondary analyses and working with us, like we really would be interested in doing so. I think, as you would see, if you click on our OSF site, this EMA study is just one of a series of studies that we hope to complete, by next October. I think right now, we've completed one kind of large national survey, and we're also, in the midst of finalizing, qualitative analyses from kind of in-depth analyses using an adapted version of the religious attachment interview that Dr. Davis is leading, along with Dr. Cynthia Kimball, Wheaton College. And you can learn more about all of these, studies on our OSF page. And looking ahead, we hope to conduct a second large national survey here in the coming months, that will hopefully lead to a second EMA study that we'll conduct by the end of the funding period. I think, like many of the teams, we're using Fincham and May's heuristic model, of the overall process of divine forgiveness to guide our research. As you'll see, with the findings that I'm going to share today, we used an EMA methodology, to examine different features of this overall model in real time, in the everyday lives of Christians. In particular, you'll see that, we were able to, to examine, the most common kind of types of sin or transgression that Christians believe that they have done, on a day-to-day basis. In addition, we wanted to describe, how often, people actually seek, God's forgiveness, when they perceive that a transgression occurred, as well as, conditional aspects, of their process for doing so. Also, we were able to explore how seeking forgiveness, confessing one's sin, and then possibly experiencing forgiveness from God were related with key indices of flourishing within the context of Christian spirituality. So these are the four aims that we addressed in our EMA study. And after I kind of highlight, our methods, I'm going to rather methodically go through the analyses that addressed each of these aims. So more to come, about findings with respect to each of these aims. So here's a flow diagram, for our recruitment process. We had two lines of recruitment. We recruit our participants through NIH Research Match, as well as snowball sampling procedures. And we ultimately ended up with a final sample of 104 Christians, and all of these folks, identified that their faith was moderately or very important in their lives. They all, viewed God as a person, with whom, they may possibly have a relationship of some sort. They also all had a conception of sin and a belief that when one sins, there's a need to possibly seek God's forgiveness, at such times. Here's a description of our sample. You can see, that we used a purposive sampling approach where we wanted to have balanced representation of different genders, as well as kind of different racial groups, within the United States. You can see that, our participants, came from different regions, as well as representing, a range of, Christian denominations or traditions, with non-denominational folks being the most common one of the denominations, in our sample. All right, so in terms of our methodology, kind of each of our participants were asked to complete 4 mini surveys a day, over a period of 21 days, through text messages that were sent to their cell phones. So they would have received these messages at the morning, early afternoon, late afternoon, and evening. We offered them $1 every time they completed an assessment, as well as a $25 bonus if they would have, answered 70% or more of the assessments. And, only with a couple exceptions, everybody, answered 70% or more. So we had really good participation and adherence, in our participants. And the mini survey consisted of 2 sections. So it started with a question, did you sin, or, transgress, since your last, assessment? If so, we asked a series of questions about the characteristics of the sin or the transgression event. We asked questions about divine forgiveness process features that might have been associated with that particular event. And then we also, assess interpersonal forgiveness process features as sort of a corollary to try to get a comparison, between divine forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness. And at every assessment, we assessed a series of psychosocial or psychospiritual outcomes, including state divine forgiveness, state moral spiritual struggles, state positive and negative affect, state self-kindness, and kind of at that moment, one's connectedness with God. All right, it's kind of hard to see some of these numbers, but you can see, relative frequencies of, characteristics of the participants' perceived transgressions and different aspects of, the divine forgiveness process. Roughly 80% or more of the time, when people perceived a sin, it was a sin of commission, something they did rather than something that they did not do that, would have been good for them to do. The sin events were largely kind of internal, in nature, involving, either their thoughts, and their feelings, and then many times, they also involved overt behaviors, or spoken words to other people. More times than not, the object of their transgressions was, a violation against their own moral beliefs, or values. In only about half of the time, was the transgression against God, which was kind of interesting. And then in terms of divine forgiveness process features, we kind of had 3 different groups that emerged, across the events, where, about a third of the time, the participants reported that they had not sought God's forgiveness, they had not confessed the sin to God, and they had not experienced God's forgiveness. In the other 2/3 of cases, everybody had sought God's forgiveness in one way or the other, and then about half of those times they had also experienced. So what that allowed us to do, as you'll see in a moment, was to compare, to see how experiencing God's forgiveness, after seeking, if this, was truly additive in terms of well-being and flourishing outcomes. All right, so our first question that we wanted to answer, with our EMA, analyses, was to try to see, if, moments when, our participants perceived that a sin or transgression occurred, we wanted to see, if these events were predictive of, our psychospiritual outcomes at the next assessment. So we're looking to see if there was a prospective association here. What you can see is that we found that there was, across the board. So, I think in keeping with, comments that, that Dr. Fincham made and Dr. Cook made already, we did find that, when people perceived a sin at the next assessment, they tended to report more depressed affect, more anxious affect, more moral struggles, less state divine forgiveness, less self-kindness, less perceived connectedness or felt connectedness with God. What we wanted to then look at, because knowing that, like, okay, there seems to be, kind of an overall effect going on here, that when people perceive a sin in real time, they seem to have a decrement or decrease, in their well-being or their flourishing, both spiritually and psychologically. So we then wanted to compare these 3 groups. We have the people that didn't seek forgiveness, didn't confess, did not experience forgiveness, compared to those who did seek, and then some of them engaged in preconditions, or I should say some of them, those who engaged in the preconditions then experienced God's forgiveness, and then about a third of the sample did not experience God's forgiveness. And interestingly, we did find that, that when we compared, the group, who had both sought and experienced, God's forgiveness, that these folks, were, statistically different, statistically better off, compared to our control group, those who did not engage in any preconditions and did not experience forgiveness, with respect to state divine forgiveness, state self-kindness, and connectedness with God. So there seems to be that for people that both seek and experience God's forgiveness, there does seem to be this sort of building of kind of psycho-spiritual resources for many people. Okay, the last kind of aim of our study was to look to see kind of temporal associations between state divine forgiveness and the other psycho-spiritual outcomes that we examined. And we hypothesized, we pre-registered this hypothesis that we would find a reciprocal association between state divine forgiveness and the other outcomes, meaning that they would both predict each other over time across the 21-day period. And we did find when compared to a primary divine forgiveness model or a secondary divine forgiveness model, we did find that this reciprocal model was statistically superior. Except when we looked at the individual effects in our model, we really only found that these reciprocal associations held, for the connection between state divine forgiveness and state connectedness with God. However, state divine forgiveness did prospectively predict each of the other psychospiritual outcomes, right? So, I mean, that led us to kind of conclude again that, sort of the state divine forgiveness really does seem to be building psychospiritual resources for many people in the wake of, having perceived transgressions or experiences of transgressing against God. And that seems to be operating as a protective effect, from a mental health or well-being standpoint. So these would be our major findings, that emerged, from our study. And kind of here's kind of an emerging kind of theoretical model, that that we're using to try to make sense of what we're learning, from our EMA study, as well as the other studies that we've conducted. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But I'd be glad to answer any questions about this figure or talk more about our findings if we have time at the end.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder, you can put some questions in the Q&A. Our next presentation will be by the team with Crystal Park and Joshua Wilt. Crystal Park is UConn Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Psychological Sciences at UConn. She has been researching and publishing on many aspects of the psychology of religion and spirituality for over 3 decades. Joshua Wilt is a senior research associate in psychological sciences at Case Western Reserve University. His research interests intersect across 2 main areas: personality structure, personality processes in daily life and their relation to eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, and number 2, existential challenges around religion and spirituality, focusing on religious spiritual struggles and supernatural attribution. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for organizing this, for Frank, for his guidance on all this, and for the Templeton Foundation for their support. We're just delighted to be part of this. Okay, so Josh and I are working on this together, and so we thought that it would be good to gosh, I've got something weird here. Good for us to sort of share our, I don't know why this is not gone. There we go. So I'm just going to give some preliminary background, and then he's going to switch over and talk about the results so far. So Frank did a great job kind of laying the groundwork and giving the history and the background. I do want to give him a shout out for the work that he and his team has been doing conceptually. And as he said, kind of backing up and starting with the foundation. And that's kind of where we're coming in. So we wanted to test some aspects of the Seeking and Experiencing Divine Forgiveness model that was published a few years ago by Frank and his colleague. We want to draw on this transactional stress and coping model and meaning-making frameworks, because this is kind of, I do meaning-making research, and this is very much a special case of meaning-making and stress and coping. And this was the model from that paper where they sort of laid out the process from having committed a transgression the whole way through to seeking, receiving divine forgiveness and recalibrating behavior. It's a wonderful model. To fully follow this, you really need to track people over time, which is, you know, what we wanted to do. These are the steps purportedly or theoretically that people go through: perceiving that you have committed a moral transgression or violation, choose to seek divine forgiveness, seeking that divine forgiveness, perceiving divine forgiveness, and experiencing personal changes following that perception of divine forgiveness. So we really wanted to focus on these two aspects, and we are doing that in a couple of different studies. So first, to look at seeking divine forgiveness in a particular situation, understanding whether people feel that that is just given, or if they need to do something to receive that divine forgiveness. And then, how do people know when they have experienced divine forgiveness? How do they know that God has forgiven them? And so we're working on developing measures of these two processes, and then using them in a prospective study that we're just in the process of launching. But we've completed the first step, which was just a cross-sectional study. And so I'm going to turn it over to Josh to give you some of those results. Stop sharing. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Crystal, and thanks everybody for attending. Thanks to the whole team and Frank and everyone. I'm going to try to be a little bit brief in the interest of buying back some time. I know this timing can be tricky on these kinds of things, so we'll see. We'll see how successful I am in doing that. So as Crystal said, we're going to be focusing in on two specific parts of the Fincham and May model: seeking divine forgiveness and then perceiving divine forgiveness. And we want to try to figure out, what are the ways in which people seek? What are the ways in which people perceive divine forgiveness? And we saw that really, to do this, since this is such a novel area, we needed to develop measures of seeking and perceiving divine forgiveness. I was very interested to see some of the other efforts at measuring divine forgiveness, which I think will be really nice complements to what we're doing. But we needed to, before we did our longitudinal perspective study, we just need to figure out, you know, in a very straightforward way, in what ways do people seek divine forgiveness? In what ways do they perceive divine forgiveness? And these were the two main research questions guiding this kind of initial work we did. So in looking to develop a measure of seeking divine forgiveness, we went to a few sources. So we looked at a lot of the literature on divine forgiveness to just see conceptually the different things that were mentioned about how people do seek divine forgiveness, and came up with a number of different ideas there. We looked at the religious coping literature. So religious coping is about using religious resources to deal with kind of stressors in general, not necessarily looking for divine forgiveness, but we thought that some of the ways in which people cope by drawing on their religious resources could be applied very well to seeking divine forgiveness. And then also we conducted a pilot study where we asked individuals who had committed something they perceived as a moral transgression, in what ways did they seek divine forgiveness to try to cover kind of all bases in our measurement. So this is kind of how we're trying to develop items to measure seeking divine forgiveness. And then in trying to measure perceiving divine forgiveness, there's really not much out there about how people perceive communication from God in terms of systematic measurement. So we did draw from this scale, the Perceived Communication from God scale that was published as part of a master's thesis done by Valencia Harriet, and trying to determine the different ways in which people feel that they actually receive communication from God. So either through some feeling, through a religious message, vision, being put in specific situations, or through nature. These are just examples of the ways people feel that they have heard from God. So we have 2 samples in our study. To be included, you had to report a transgression and endorse at least some belief in God. And then we had an undergraduate sample and a sample that was recruited by the research firm Prolific. So we have large sample sizes, predominantly Christian religious affiliation, about 3/4 women in the undergrad sample, about 2/3 in the Prolific sample, and most individuals identified as white, although we did have some ethnic and racial diversity. They completed an online survey, and we asked them this prompt about a specific transgression that they might have committed. So we asked them to recall an event in their lives in which they did something that violated their morals and that they felt bad about. We told them that nearly everyone has done such things more than once in order to normalize this. And then we wanted them to choose an especially memorable event and then describe it. And then we asked people questions about what they did to seek divine forgiveness. We had generated 62 items, and then how they perceive divine forgiveness related to this transgression. Here are the prompts that we administered before giving the items about seeking and perceiving divine forgiveness. And then I just want to slow down just for a second here, because this next slide, although it might look a little bit complex, I think it is the best way to get across the structure of the items for seeking and perceiving divine forgiveness. So here you'll see basically a correlation matrix, but overlaid on a heat map, where you'll see basically different shades of blue indicating the strength of the association of the items with each other. So there you see, basically I want to point out just a couple things about this. Given that the color is pretty uniform across items, this kind of indicates that general factor is underlying the structure of seeking divine forgiveness, that there's kind of one thing going on. But then you kind of see the blocks of darker blue as well, indicating that groups of items kind of clustered or factored together more strongly, which would indicate these group factors in different particular ways of seeking divine forgiveness. And I'll get into those a little bit more in detail on a later slide. And then you also see a correlation plot for the perceiving divine forgiveness items. And I'm showing you just the undergraduate sample, but the Prolific samples results look very similar to this. We see kind of a general factor because you have the blue kind of permeating at a similar level throughout, but then you also have these different groups of items, which would indicate the presence of group factors. So to examine this statistically, we did these bifactor analyses where we found a strong general factor, but also could look at group factors in the particular ways that people kind of sought divine forgiveness. Again, results similar across undergraduate and Prolific samples. So people were doing things to seek divine forgiveness, like look for spiritual conversion, try to remove sin, looking for help or guidance, improve morality. Some of these kind of echo some of the measures that you saw, I think, earlier. Of divine forgiveness. People can plead with God or try to make amends. And then in perceiving divine forgiveness, we also had a strong general factor, and then a group factor of ways in which people perceive being forgiven. They could experience visions, have a strong sense of relief, kind of notice different situational patterns, get an insight, or kind of receive divine forgiveness through religious teachings. So we think that the next steps in our research will be to look prospectively and longitudinally about how people go from seeking divine forgiveness in these different ways to perceiving divine forgiveness. And we want to see like which strategies of seeking divine forgiveness are most effective in general. Does the effectiveness of each of these different types of ways of seeking depend on the different ways of perceiving? So do they line up kind of differently across domains. And then we can also look at different combinations of how people seek and receive divine forgiveness to get a more nuanced, kind of fine-grained approach to this process. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, and again, can do the ask questions in the Q&A. I know there's so much rich information here that we all want to think about. Our next presentation is by Professor Martino Rodriguez. He's a clinical psychologist and research associate at the Institute for Culture and Society at the University of Navarra. He completed his doctoral training at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Much of his research agenda focuses on topics related to psychotherapy research, religion, spirituality, and translational research, such as improving psychotherapy training in low-income countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you for the invitation to share our research in this seminar and to the Harvard group for hosting this seminar, for Professor Fincham for leading this big project in divine forgiveness, and thanks to the Templeton Foundation for making it possible. As you can see in the slide, our project is focused on the experience of divine forgiveness in Spanish-speaking Catholics. And our team includes scholars and Catholic priests with diverse global and multidisciplinary backgrounds, led by myself as PI, and Maria Calatrava as co-PI, along with other researchers from Spain and the US, and also Dr. Carmen Callizo as postdoctoral researcher. Our team also includes some consultants like Stephen Sandage and over 20 Catholic priests. The project is based at the University of Navarra in Spain, and we have other 4 partnered institutions. This collaboration between researchers, priests, and institutions enables unique access to data on confession within the profile of Spanish-speaking Catholics, which allows an in-depth exploration of DF. The topic is underrepresented in existing literature, where Protestant perspectives have been more commonly studied. However, given that Catholicism comprises approximately 80% of the global population, a significant proportion of whom are Spanish-speaking, an examination of this group is relevant. Examining divine forgiveness within Catholicism requires understanding the sacrament of confession, as it is the prescribed method for Catholics to seek forgiveness for God, and should be practiced regularly, at least once a year or after a grave sin. This sacrament entails self-reflection, a sincere confession of sins to a priest acting as an intermediary, absolution, and a penance. Although practiced in various religions, confession is particularly central in Catholicism, where the priest's intermediary role is essential. The process of confession involves not only the penitent and their view of God, as may occur in some Protestant traditions, but also the confessor making the interpersonal relationship between penitent and confessor central to understanding the dynamics through which divine forgiveness is experienced. The confessor-penitent relationship could shape the experience of DF, either facilitating or hindering it and influencing related psychological processes. For example, when penitents view the confessor as approachable, they might feel more forgiven. This dynamic could depend on the personal characteristics of both the penitent and the confessor and their psychological engagement in the confession process, an area still unexplored. To understand these dynamics, we want to explore how penitent and confessor variables influence DF through confession, how the relationship with the confessor impacts seeking and experiencing forgiveness, and how DF and psychological processes are related or can impact flourishing. To address these questions, we are conducting 3 studies. In study 1, we conducting 25 interviews with priests. The goal is to understand the confession process, the relationship between divine forgiveness and psychological processes, and the connection between divine forgiveness and well-being. In the study 2, we are also carrying out a cross-sectional mixed methods study to explore variables related with penitents' general disposition toward experiencing DF. This will involve questionnaires and open-ended questions. In study 3, we using longitudinal mixed methods design. We will assess divine forgiveness both dispositionally and in response to specific transgressions in the context of Catholic spiritual retreats. This study will evaluate participants before the retreat, immediately afterward, 3 weeks later, and following any confession during this period. Participants will be compared with control groups, those who did not attend the retreat and or did not confess. Our most advanced findings came from study 1, the analysis of priests' interviews. We are employing a framework analysis approach which aims to contextualize and expand certain phases of Fincham and May's model. Our analysis shows penitents' actions, such as the frequency of confession, prayer, or religious education, alongside with certain personality traits, like tendencies toward shame or scrupulosity, and personal spiritual experiences, such as moments of conversion, are linked to how they engage with an experience of divine forgiveness. Confessor-related variables were also found to be crucial. For example, priests who exhibit compassionate seem to facilitate a more profound experience of forgiveness for the penitent. The relationship between the penitent and the confessor is likewise a powerful factor. Spiritual guidance from the confessor, a personal rapport with him, and a sense of connection to the religious community all contribute to the penitent's perception and experience of DF. This bond between penitent and confessor might serve as an anchor in the penitent's spiritual journey, making the sacrament more impactful. Beyond the direct experience of DF, our analysis revealed additional layers of connection with self-forgiveness and well-being. Experiencing DF appears to support penitents in achieving self-forgiveness. Additionally, priests note that seeking and experiencing DF has a positive association with the penitent's overall well-being and flourishing. Some priests also highlighted the therapeutic qualities of confession, comparing aspects of it to psychological therapy. This suggests a broader role of confession, not only as a spiritual practice, but also as an experience with potential psychological benefits. Beyond the academic publications, we aim to bring our findings to society and religious communities. We plan to host an online conference tailored for a broad audience, including scholars, clergy, and general public. And additionally, we will develop a practical guide to share key findings, specifically designed to institutions where Catholic priests undergo their formation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our next presentation will be by Professor Joanne Sang. Professor Sang is at Baylor University and studies the social psychology of religion, prejudice, gratitude, and forgiveness.
Hello, thank you for having me. Let me see if I can get my slides up. Okay, so the niche that we were trying to get here was first to provide an experimental methodology looking at the relationship between perceptions of divine forgiveness and social or relational outcomes. So we've heard a lot about some individual well-being outcomes that are associated with divine forgiveness. Frank mentioned self-forgiveness, depression, and we were looking to add to those outcomes, but looking at relational outcomes, because forgiveness, including divine forgiveness, is a relational concept. It's the perception of forgiveness from someone else, in this case, a divine agent. And so it should have relational or social outcomes. Some of the things that we wanted to look at are closeness to God, gratitude, which is where you feel positively towards someone because of a benefit that you received from them. And this benefit in this case would be forgiveness. And then, like others, we're also looking at forgiveness of other people. And I also wanted to see if there were possibly some antisocial outcomes to divine forgiveness, if there were some not like an objective outcome of divine forgiveness, but that some people might feel that being forgiven might give them license to do some things that maybe don't uphold their moral standards. So we conducted an experiment. You, of course, can't experimentally manipulate whether God forgives you or not, but you can experimentally manipulate whether people are thinking about God forgiving them or not. So what we did is have people write about a time when they felt forgiven by whatever they consider the divine, or write about a time where they felt like they were forgiven by another person as a comparison. And then we had a neutral condition where we just have people write about their daily schedule. And so the thought here is that when you write about divine forgiveness, you're thinking more about that and perhaps experiencing a state of divine forgiveness. So like some others, we're looking at the state effects of divine forgiveness. And we spent a couple of pilot studies trying to get the writing part down. And so this is what we've come up with at this point. For people thinking about divine forgiveness, first we instruct them, here's what we mean by divine. And to think about a specific time where they did something that they regretted, but then they felt forgiven by God. And we because of pilot studies, we wanted to focus very much on a specific time, because we found that especially when we asked people to think about divine forgiveness, if we didn't instruct them to think of a specific time, some people started writing about theological beliefs about being forgiven by God, which is also interesting and worthy of study, but then it wasn't standardized between the divine forgiveness and the interpersonal forgiveness condition, because when people were writing about being forgiven by another, they would write about something, a specific time they were forgiven. So we had people respond to prompts. We asked them what they were forgiven for and who forgave them, how they felt, and how they feel about this experience, just getting them to really immerse themselves in the recollection of this experience and to write about it, so hopefully inducing a state. We gave similar instructions to have people write about being forgiven by another person, another human. And so you can see that the instructions are very similar, but we told people to think about another human being, someone that they knew, or perhaps a stranger, but that forgave them, and to write similarly about how they felt, who forgave them, and what the experience was like. And then just as a control, we had people write about their daily schedule. What do you do when you wake up? They wrote about that a little bit, just to make sure that if we find any effects, it's not due just to the act of writing, but to actually thinking about being forgiven by another person or by the divine. So in our first study, we looked at correlates between thinking about divine forgiveness and some relational outcomes. We did find that people who wrote about divine forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness said that they felt more forgiven in the moment compared to people who were just writing about their day. We did not, surprisingly, find a difference between the conditions on positive affect and, in fact, people who wrote about divine forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness felt more negative affect or negative emotions than we expected. And I think it's because when you think about being forgiven by the divine or forgiven by another person, you're also thinking about the transgression that you committed. And so that also activated negative emotions like guilt. Some things that we did find on the positive side is that people who wrote about both divine forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness said that they experienced gratitude. And they also experienced something called transcendent indebtedness. So Nelson and her colleagues looked at feeling indebted to people, but they distinguished between transcendent indebtedness, where you want to repay someone for something they've done to you, compared to a more transactional indebtedness where you feel obligated to repay someone. And so when people were thinking about being forgiven by God, especially, they were more likely to say that they felt this wanting to repay God. So it's a more positive form of indebtedness compared to the negative indebtedness that the literature studied before. So in some additional follow-up studies, I want to look at the different relational behaviors that are going to be associated with thinking about divine forgiveness. So right now we're in the middle of collecting data on forgiving behaviors. We have participants come into the laboratory and experience a transgression from someone who they think is another participant who took resources from them. And so when people have just written about being forgiven by God, does that change their reaction to this offense compared to people who write about being forgiven by someone else or being forgiven by, just writing about their schedule? And then we also think that there might be some action in gratitude, since there was a relationship between divine forgiveness and self-reported gratitude. We want to see if writing about divine forgiveness also affects people's grateful behaviors. When someone does something for you in real time, are you then going to experience more gratitude and then do something more positive towards them? But we also want to check in our fourth study about moral licensing that it's possible that writing about divine forgiveness compared to writing about a transgression without thinking about forgiveness might reduce guilt, and guilt can have pro-social outcomes. And so it's possible that in certain circumstances, if thinking about being forgiven by God increases your moral self-concept or decreases your guilt, that this might lead temporarily, at least, to less helping and less pro-sociality. So we feel like it's important to look at both sides of the coin. So basically the contribution we're trying to make is looking at these relational outcomes in addition to individual outcomes, and looking to find the boundary conditions of any positive effects of thinking about divine forgiveness. Future research might also look at, since it seems like gratitude is pretty strongly linked to thinking about divine forgiveness, previous research by Desteno and colleagues have found that feeling gratitude is also related to paying it forward. So helping people who aren't even related to the benefit that you've been given. And this might be especially likely when we look at divine forgiveness, that one of the ways that you can pay God back is by paying it forward to other people. And that might fulfill these feelings of transcendent indebtedness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for another rich and profound presentation. And now I will be introducing our last speaker, and then hopefully we'll have a little time for questions at the end. Professor Kurt Gray will be presenting now. He is a social psychologist at UNC Chapel Hill, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. He studies morality, religion, and politics, and how best to bridge divides.
Hi all. Give me one sec, switch my monitor, and we will be good to go. Sec, appreciate your patience. Okay, here we go. We're good? Yeah, I'll just take the silence as success. Okay. So I'll talk about forgiving a good heart, the role of motives, mind perception, lay understandings of divine forgiveness. This is a project really overseen by my grad student, Sam Abrams, who is now working for Amtrak, shuttling our people instead of just our thoughts and prayers. All right, so imagine that you do something, or you know about someone who does something immoral, and then that person asks for forgiveness, right, as people are wont to do. And then the question is, well, how do people make sense of whether they understand if they've been forgiven or not? And in this project, we're really interested in contrasting two senses of forgiveness. One, which has been studied a lot in the literature, interpersonal forgiveness, right? Asking another person for forgiveness. So if you maybe stole money from someone, now you're asking them for their forgiveness, or if you offended your spouse, asking them for their forgiveness. But on the other hand, why we're all here, after all, you could also ask God for forgiveness for this offense. Now, of course, you didn't do this offense, against God, although maybe in some ways you did. But how do people make sense of whether they've been forgiven when it comes to God versus other people? And so one thing that we think is really important are perceptions of mind, how people make sense of the minds of those they're asking for forgiveness. And so when it comes to other people, maybe you don't always know what someone else is thinking, right? This is the problem of other minds, like their thoughts, their feelings can be opaque. But this problem is even more heightened when it comes to questions of divine forgiveness, because you're really trying to figure out, well, what is God thinking about me? How does he feel about me and my offense, right? And so because of this ultimate ambiguity about the minds of others, we're left to perceive these minds. And so there's been lots of work on mind perception, and a fair amount of work on how we perceive the mind of God, including a number of important scholars. And so we know that people perceive the mind of God somewhat like humans, but also somewhat differently, right? God is perceived as omniscient, as all-loving, and as omnipotent. And these features, these kind of omni features, influence not only how people relate to God, but also how people might expect perceptions of God when it comes to divine forgiveness. We're also studying in this project not only kind of how people understand the mind of God, but also how people make sense of whether God forgives their motives or their offenses, whether they have good or bad motives. So maybe you steal something because you just want to be richer, right? Or maybe you steal something because you want to help out orphans, right? Those are very different motives for an offense, even if the offense is still the same of theft. And so there's a couple different understandings or hypotheses of how motives might matter for divine versus interpersonal forgiveness. On one hand, God is seen as very morally concerned, right? The kind of like big God idea. God really cares about your motives and what's inside your heart, whether that's good or bad. On the other hand, God might forgive, all, might just wants to love us and know that, like has grace and generally cares about us as a kind of all loving God. And so maybe God cares a little less about motives than other people. And so these are the kind of contrasting predictions, right? Does God care more about motives? Does God care less about motives? And one thing that is clear, right, is that God is more insightful into our motives than other people. And so this might really matter when it comes to understanding the divine forgiveness, especially as it relates to kind of disclosure of motives. With another person, right, you might have to tell them that you have good motives behind an offense, or, it might be worse if you tell them it's bad motives. But God should know those things. God should know those things. And so maybe you don't need to disclose those motives. But at the same time, right, this, as came up in previous presentations, right, maybe the idea of confession seems important for forgiveness as well, right? God wants you to disclose motives, even if he knows what those are. And so in our first study, I'll just talk about two studies. We did, there's 5 studies in this manuscript, but in the first study, we asked Christians to read a series of vignettes about the offenses of other people. And we manipulated whether the motive was good or bad, whether they disclosed the motive, whether they told God or the other person, and whether the forgiver was God or another person. So it's a kind of 2x2x2 design. And so here's an example scenario. Alex and Jamie have been working together on a project for months. One day, Alex notices that Jamie's overwhelmed with the workload. Alex decides to complete the project on his own because he wants to alleviate Jamie's stress. Good motive, okay? And then Jamie gets in trouble for not contributing to the project. Alex feels terrible. He confesses and sincerely apologizes to both God and Jamie. Alex explained why he completed the project alone and asked for forgiveness. So disclosing the motives, good motives. On the other hand, you could have something different. He decides to complete the project on his own because he wants his boss to see that Jamie's a slacker. And then after he apologizes, he doesn't explain why he completed the project alone, right? So there's no disclosure here. And so if it's a morally concerned God, motive goodness might matter more for divine forgiveness than personal forgiveness. But an unconditionally loving God, motive goodness might matter less, or perhaps not at all. In both cases, though, we predict that disclosure should matter less for divine forgiveness than interpersonal forgiveness because God knows your motive, even if you don't tell him. So here are the data. Again, it's a little complicated, but here we go. So when you're thinking about other people, so human forgiver, right, that's the left side, people expect motives to matter. Great. As you might expect, good motives, more forgiveness. People also expect that disclosure to help, especially when it comes to good motives. So if you do something and you tell someone, like, the reason I did that is because I really had a good motive, people are like, okay, you're more likely to be forgiven. So these things make sense. Right, disclosure is higher. And when it comes to God, right, you see in general much higher expectations of divine forgiveness compared to interpersonal forgiveness. Motives still matter. There's still a gap between green and yellow bars, but that gap is smaller than in the human condition. And so it's still there, right, but it matters less. And there's also a bump for disclosing your bad motives, especially compared to not disclosing that, right? That's the kind of confession effect. People expect more forgiveness from God when you disclose your motives, especially when they're bad. And so here we found support for kind of both hypotheses. Motives do matter, but less, suggesting that people think about God as somewhat morally concerned, but ultimately more unconditionally loving. And so what about kind of like God's unique insight? How much does that matter? And is that driving the effects? When you get people to rate kind of like God's perceived insight into your kind of motives and the circumstances of offenses, perceptions of God are much higher. And so in the last study, the second study I'll talk about, we manipulated the mind perception of people to approximate God to see if that helped drive the effect. And so people ran a scenario of Alex and Jamie. We manipulated motive goodness, and then we manipulated whether the forgiver was either Jamie, who is not insightful, not loving, Jamie, very insightful, very loving, or God. And so here's like, you know, Jamie's selfish, he's insensitive, he's spiteful, and he doesn't know what people are thinking, very like not godlike. This is a little more godlike, kind, compassionate, generous. He can read people's minds and knows exactly what they're thinking, so a little more divine. And so what we find when we manipulate good, bad motives and the condition for God being most loving, a person being high and loving or low and loving, we can show for like for a low loving condition, motives kind of matter. But you know, it's not a ton when he's like spiteful. When Jamie, the human, is more loving and more insightful, we really find that there's like this kind of like big effect. But this effect is not as big as God, right? So there is the fact of like the high loving person with good motives is just as likely to forgive you as God when you have bad motives, and then the highest all is God, divine forgiveness when you have good motives. So mind perception in humans accounts for some things, but of course God is much more benevolent and much more insightful than even a benevolent, insightful human being. And that's kind of interesting that the most loving human is equal to the kind of God in the bad motive condition. Okay, and so in sum, what we show is that when it comes to perceptions of divine forgiveness for others, and we have some data about how people perceive it for the self. The spoiler is people think that God forgives everything they do. So a little more self-focused. People do think that God is morally concerned, but less morally concerned in terms of motives than other people, and then more kind of this unconditional loving kind of perception comes out. So motive mattered less for God than for other people. And so I think it's really important to study divine forgiveness as it relates or is in contrast with interpersonal forgiveness. And this is just the kind of first attempt. People seem to see God as unconditional loving when it comes here, more than morally concerned. And I hope, you know, this is just like one interesting puzzle or piece of a puzzle that we're all working on about divine forgiveness, and excited that all this work is being done. Thanks to my colleagues and collaborators, thanks to Sam who ran the study, and thanks to the funding. And Frank. Okay, there we go.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists for these really profound and rich presentations. You all did such a great job on time, so we have about 9 minutes for questions, so thank you so much. I know that there's lots more to talk about, but we'll, do what we can with this limited time and hope that this conversation continues afterwards. So a lot of the questions were answered over the question and answer, and anybody in the audience, please feel free to add some questions in the question and answer. Looking at some of the questions that are still open, I'm seeing, I think, some kind of questions around the relationship between belief and divine forgiveness. Is your belief system important when trying to understand your experience of divine forgiveness? So then is it important to account for denominational differences when studying different Christian groups? That's one kind of way of thinking about it. And then I think another way of thinking about it, just to kind of bring the questions together, is also, there are belief systems where there's agnostic or atheist beliefs, so no understanding of God. And so in those systems, is there some kind of thing that could be divine forgiveness that's still separate from self-forgiveness? So do any of our panelists want to answer any part of those questions?
Oh, yeah, I'll just take the first part that I think is your belief systems really do matter, in particular, like how those perceptions shape your view of God, at least as our project suggests, right? There's various ways of seeing God, from kind of more human-like to more distant that other people have done, but also kind of more loving, more personally concerned with you and your spiritual growth. And so to the extent that divine forgiveness differs from interpersonal forgiveness, I think that it really matters kind of like your perceptions of God. And of course, there's more explicit beliefs you have, and then more implicit beliefs that maybe you're raised with, or that anchor on anthropomorphism and so forth. But I think it certainly matters kind of like how you think about God and your likelihood of being forgiven. It's a good question.
And I'll add, I guess it's an open-ended one in a sense, because we first need, not to be self-serving in my response, but we first need a systematic, robust measure of the construct to find out if different theological differences between, say, Christian denominations influence that construct. So I think it would be a very interesting path for future research, and we can, I think, theoretically, we could all probably say that there would be differences, but to actually do the research in a systematic way, I think that's still one of the next steps to come.
Thank you. And then, looking across these different studies, it seems to certainly be the case that sometimes people want to experience divine forgiveness, but they're not. And so I was wondering what you're finding in regards to what the barriers to divine forgiveness might be. And then conversely, what are ways that you are seeing that are there that can encourage or entice divine forgiveness? The experience of divine forgiveness.
I can offer a response to that question. Yeah, so I think with our EMA study, we were able to, to test, and compare, if persons who perceive that they have transgressed or sinned, and if they had experienced or not experienced, to see, if indeed, like, kind of over time, if they're worse off, psychologically and spiritually. And it's interesting, we did not sort of find, support, at least in our data, that people who seek and don't experience, so there's something, kind of hindering their ability to perceive or experience forgiveness, if they're necessarily worse off in terms of like distress outcomes, like depressed affect or anxious affect or moral struggle, right? That actually they're pretty comparable, except, it's like, unfortunately, they don't seem to have the same access to like positive psychospiritual resources, right? So I thought that was sort of an interesting finding that we did not expect to find. I think we thought that these folks were maybe going to be a little bit more distressed over time, and at least our data isn't showing that they are. But I think that the factor or the framework that we're really using to try to understand what might be operating here is like a religious attachment framework, that there might be, sort of maybe just a deeper, kind of insecurity, in perceived relationship with God, that might be, kind of complicating the divine forgiveness project and maybe hindering the ability to really perceive and experience, God's forgiveness in real felt ways in such cases. But we're in the process of running those analyses now. Yeah.
So to be continued. We don't have the analyses yet. We've run some quick analyses on the original interviews. We've also started some meta-theme analysis to start looking at barriers and facilitators. We haven't looked at its outcome in relation to well-being, but it does seem that one of the factors which leads people to still be stuck in not feeling divine forgiveness is that they are not at peace, perhaps with their part in what brought about the incident. That I remember one person in particular who was very angry, and when I asked her to talk about how this violated God, she kept getting stuck on the parameters of the incident itself, and it had to do with abuse of her son by another son, both of whom were adopted. And both of whom had been trafficked and abused themselves. And in the process of it, her interview is much more about anger until she gets toward the end. And she was finally able to frame that there was a piece of it that she thinks she is justifiably angry about, but other pieces in which there was something she could do. And so she made some commitments to do something different. So I think it's that what is going on in process of our relation. This is part of it. What is going on in the process of our relationship to the sin itself? I also think that there are some who simply cannot let violation go for whatever reason, and I think they may need many of those people. It's very common, and I think we need to think more carefully about that group of people.
Excellent. That time went by, yeah, as quick as any. So I know that was kind of a blitz, but just, yeah, really grateful for everybody who's, was here to present, everybody who is in the audience, and just for all the work that's being done. You could just see in the next, 5-10 years, the impact of this work. Yeah, it's really exciting. Yeah, with that, I think we can conclude. I hope this seminar, helped answer some questions and maybe created some new ones. And as Kate said earlier, maybe this will be kind of the starting point of ongoing conversations amongst the panelists and those in the audience as well. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.